In this episode, we're going to bring together many of the themes you've been building: measurement, accountability, change discipline, and continuous monitoring, and use them to define the objectives of a risk program in a way that is real, owned, and usable. A risk program is not just a document, and it is not just a meeting schedule. It is the organization's ongoing system for identifying risk, deciding what to do about it, and proving that decisions are being executed over time. Beginners sometimes imagine risk management as a once-a-year exercise where leadership sets priorities, but in modern environments, risk changes constantly as systems change, threats change, and business goals shift. The objective of this lesson is to show how you define risk program objectives that connect to what the organization cares about, assign owners who can actually act, involve stakeholders who must share responsibility, and set a scope that prevents the program from becoming either toothless or overwhelming. By the end, you should understand how to define objectives that drive behavior and can be tracked as real posture improvement. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Risk program objectives are statements of what the organization intends to achieve in risk management, expressed in a way that supports decision-making and accountability. A weak objective sounds like improved security, which is too vague to guide action and too broad to measure. A stronger objective connects to concrete outcomes like reducing exposure time on critical assets, improving the organization's ability to detect and contain incidents, or ensuring that key policy requirements remain consistently met through continuous monitoring. Objectives matter because they shape what work gets funded, what work gets prioritized, and what work gets measured. They also shape culture because objectives communicate what leadership values and what trade-offs the organization is willing to make. Beginners sometimes assume objectives are only for leadership, but objectives also help working teams because they provide context for why certain tasks are urgent and why certain controls must be maintained even when delivery pressure is high. When objectives are clear, teams can align their daily decisions with the program's purpose rather than treating risk work as random interruptions. A risk program must also be designed around ownership, because risk does not manage itself, and no objective will be achieved if no one is accountable for it. Ownership means a specific role or team is responsible for driving progress toward an objective, coordinating across dependencies, and reporting status honestly. In many organizations, risk is shared, meaning security may coordinate the program, but business owners and system owners ultimately own the risk because they own the assets and outcomes at stake. Beginners often assume the security team owns all risk, but that assumption creates failure because security rarely has authority to change every system, schedule every patch, or approve every business trade-off. A healthy program assigns owners to objectives in a way that matches authority and control. If an objective involves reducing vulnerability exposure on critical assets, ownership should involve the leaders who can coordinate remediation capacity and maintenance windows. If an objective involves improving incident response readiness, ownership should involve the teams responsible for operations and escalation. When ownership aligns with control, objectives stop being aspirational and start being executable. Stakeholders are the people and groups who influence or are impacted by the objective, and stakeholder involvement is essential because risk often sits at the boundaries between teams. A stakeholder might be an engineering team whose changes can increase or reduce exposure, an operations team that controls deployment and recovery, a legal team that influences third-party terms, or a business leader who decides risk appetite for a product launch. Stakeholders matter because objectives often require coordinated behavior, such as integrating security into change control or maintaining policy compliance through continuous monitoring. Beginners sometimes think stakeholder involvement means inviting everyone to meetings, but effective stakeholder involvement is more precise. It means involving the people who must make decisions, provide resources, and accept trade-offs, and ensuring they understand how the objective affects their responsibilities. A risk program becomes credible when stakeholders are engaged early, commitments are explicit, and trade-offs are documented rather than argued repeatedly. When stakeholders feel included and respected, they are more likely to support the program and less likely to treat it as external enforcement. Clear scope is the boundary that defines what the risk program covers and what it does not cover, and it is one of the most important design decisions because scope determines whether the program can actually deliver results. If scope is too broad, the program becomes overwhelmed, priorities become unclear, and teams stop paying attention because everything feels urgent. If scope is too narrow, the program may look neat while missing the largest sources of risk, which creates a false sense of safety. A clear scope often begins by defining what parts of the organization and what categories of assets are in scope, such as critical services, systems handling sensitive data, or major third-party integrations. It also defines what types of risk decisions the program will manage, such as vulnerability risk, identity risk, change-driven risk, or third-party risk. Beginners sometimes assume scope should include everything to be responsible, but a mature program often starts with critical scope and expands as capability grows. Scope clarity reduces friction because teams know when the program applies and what expectations exist, and it reduces confusion because the program does not constantly chase unrelated issues. A strong method for defining objectives is to connect them to the organization's risk posture, which is the current state of exposure and readiness. If posture analysis shows that critical vulnerabilities remain open too long, an objective might focus on reducing exposure windows and improving remediation flow. If posture analysis shows frequent change-driven incidents, an objective might focus on integrating security impact analysis and improving change control discipline. If posture analysis shows weak visibility, an objective might focus on improving logging and monitoring coverage for critical assets and ensuring policy requirements are continuously monitored. Objectives should be shaped by what is actually driving risk in the environment, not by generic checklists that may not match reality. Beginners sometimes assume risk programs begin with an ideal framework, but the most effective programs begin with the organization's actual pain points and exposures. This does not mean ignoring long-term maturity, but it means prioritizing the objectives that will meaningfully reduce risk in the near term. When objectives are grounded in posture, they also become easier to explain and easier to defend in budgeting and planning conversations. Objectives must also be measurable, but measurability should be tied to outcomes rather than to activity. Measuring activity, such as the number of assessments completed, can create a false sense of progress if exposure does not shrink. Measuring outcomes, such as reduced time that critical systems remain exposed to high-risk weaknesses, provides clearer evidence that the program is working. For beginners, it helps to think about what would convince you that the organization is safer, such as faster containment of incidents, fewer repeat incidents from the same root causes, and higher consistency of baseline controls on critical assets. Outcome measures can be supported by process measures, such as how quickly findings are triaged or how consistently change reviews include security impact analysis, because those process measures often predict outcomes. The key is that the measures should be stable enough to trend and clear enough that different audiences interpret them the same way. When measures are stable, leaders can see progress and can identify where barriers prevent progress, which is what makes a risk program feel like a real management system rather than a theory. A risk program objective should also include explicit boundaries on decision-making, meaning what decisions are handled at what level and how risk acceptance is managed. Some risk decisions can be made by working teams, such as choosing a safer implementation pattern within an agreed baseline. Other decisions require leadership acceptance, such as delaying remediation on a critical system beyond target timelines or accepting a third-party risk because a partnership is essential. Beginners sometimes assume risk acceptance is a failure, but risk acceptance is a normal part of organizational life, as long as it is deliberate, time-bounded, and visible. A mature risk program defines how exceptions are documented, who can approve them, what compensating controls are required, and when exceptions are reviewed. This prevents risk acceptance from becoming silent drift, where deviations accumulate without awareness. Clear risk acceptance pathways reduce conflict because teams know how to request exceptions and leaders know when they are being asked to accept trade-offs. This is a core part of defining objectives with owners and stakeholders, because it clarifies what happens when the objective cannot be met immediately. The scope of the program should also define the cadence of governance, meaning how often objectives are reviewed, how often posture is reported, and how often priorities are adjusted. If governance is too frequent, it can become distracting and performative. If governance is too infrequent, problems can grow for months without intervention. A practical approach is to align cadence to risk and change pace, focusing more frequent attention on critical assets and high-risk exposures. Governance should also focus on removing barriers, such as unclear ownership, insufficient change windows, or missing visibility, rather than only asking for status updates. Beginners sometimes think governance is about reporting upward, but strong governance is about enabling execution by making decisions and allocating resources. When governance is designed this way, teams see it as support rather than as surveillance. Over time, governance that removes barriers improves both security posture and delivery reliability because it reduces last-minute crises that disrupt everyone. Third parties and shared responsibilities should be included in the program's scope explicitly because external relationships often create risk that does not fit neatly into internal ownership models. If a vendor handles sensitive data or has access to critical systems, the risk program should define objectives that ensure vendor access is controlled, vendor changes are understood, and incident notification expectations are clear. Beginners sometimes assume vendor risk is a separate program, but in practice, vendor risk affects the same outcomes as internal risk, such as availability and data protection. Including third-party considerations in scope prevents blind spots and helps leadership see the full exposure picture. It also clarifies who is responsible for oversight, because vendor relationships often span procurement, legal, security, and the business team that owns the relationship. When risk program objectives include third-party considerations, the organization becomes less surprised by external failures and more able to respond quickly when something changes outside its direct control. As you bring this lesson together, defining risk program objectives with owners, stakeholders, and clear scope is about building a management system that can actually operate in the real world. Objectives must be concrete, connected to risk posture, and expressed in outcome terms that can be measured and trended. Owners must be assigned in a way that matches authority, so accountability is fair and execution is possible. Stakeholders must be engaged so responsibilities are shared and trade-offs are made consciously rather than through conflict and avoidance. Scope must be clear so the program focuses on what matters most and does not drown in everything at once, while still capturing the major sources of risk including critical systems, sensitive data, and key third-party relationships. Governance cadence and risk acceptance pathways must be defined so the program can adapt as threats and priorities shift without becoming chaotic. When these elements are in place, the risk program becomes a steady engine that aligns decisions, resources, and behavior toward reduced exposure and improved resilience over time. And that is the real purpose of risk management in any modern security program.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.